The road into Coldwater Hollow was little more than a cracked vein of dirt, winding through miles of Appalachian forest that hadn't seen sunlight in years. The trees stood too close together, whispering when the wind passed through, as if gossiping about the stranger who dared enter their domain. Every mile deeper meant another signal lost, another sound swallowed. It wasn't until the rusted sign appeared, Coldwater, Pop. 27, that the weight of isolation became real. The man behind the wheel, a regional historian with a knack for forgotten things, had come chasing a rumor. He'd read a letter, yellowed and shaking at the edges, describing a man who fathered his own sister and called her his daughter. It was signed only with the name Wren. No first name. No date. Just that single word that had haunted local archives for decades, scribbled on death certificates that never listed fathers and marriage records that were more like closed circles. The town itself looked like it was holding its breath. Porches sagged under years of rain, windows were boarded from the inside, and faces vanished behind curtains when the outsider's car passed. Somewhere beyond those crooked homes, deep in the woods where mist never lifted, lay the remains of the Wren cabin, the place where Elias Wren had lived with his mother, Sarah, and where something unspeakable had taken root. At the diner, the air smelled like damp wood and fear. No one would meet his eyes when he asked about the Wrens. One old man, his skin the color of dry parchment, finally leaned in and muttered, "Best not to stir them bones, son. Some blood runs too thick to die." The historian laughed nervously, but the old man didn't. That night, he followed a dirt trail that locals said led nowhere. The path wound through the black heart of the woods, where the moonlight turned the fog to milk. Then, the smell hit him, iron, rot, and something that felt alive. Ahead stood the remains of a house swallowed by ivy and time. In the center of the floor, carved into rotting wood, was a name scratched over and over again, Elias Wren. When the wind rose, it carried a sound, a woman's hum, soft and mournful, drifting through the hollow. And for the first time, the historian understood why Coldwater had no children playing in its streets. Some stories, he realized, don't stay buried. They breed. Coldwater Hollow sat hidden in the folds of the Appalachian Mountains, far from the reach of maps or memories. It was the kind of place where the sun seemed hesitant to linger, where fog clung to the treetops like it had something to protect. The few who knew of it spoke softly, as though the name itself might summon the things that slept within its borders. This town wasn't just forgotten by time, it had been deliberately erased, buried beneath generations of silence and superstition. Those who left never spoke of it again, and those who stayed carried the kind of secrets that twisted faces and darkened hearts. The mountains guarded them like a curse disguised as geography, their ridges rising like broken spines against a pale gray sky. In Coldwater Hollow, everything seemed older than it should be. The houses leaned under the weight of their own decay, their windows blind with dust and their doors warped from years of rain. The air carried a faint metallic tang, as if the ground itself was rusting. There were no streetlights, no hum of engines, no laughter from porches, only the endless chorus of cicadas and the slow groan of the forest shifting in its sleep. It was a world detached from progress, existing in a strange limbo between the living and the dead. People here had faces that mirrored the land, weathered, pale, and watchful. Their eyes followed strangers with quiet suspicion, as if expecting history to repeat itself again in the form of another outsider asking questions best left unanswered. The isolation of the town wasn't just physical, it was inherited. The bloodlines in Coldwater Hollow were closed circles, bound by old names and older sins. Families had lived here for so long that no one could remember their beginnings. Births were whispered events, deaths were quiet disappearances, and the line between family and fate had long since blurred. To the outside world, it was a dying town. To those who lived there, it was a living memory of something that should have been buried long ago. Every rusted cross on the hill, every overgrown path, every crumbling photograph in an attic told the same story. The town had secrets so dark that even the soil seemed unwilling to let them go. Deep within this forgotten valley, among the mist and decay, the legend of the Wren family took root. It was whispered that their blood ran thicker than most, that the line between sin and survival had been erased generations ago. The Wrens were the heart of Coldwater Hollow's darkness, and even now, the town still trembled beneath the weight of what they had done. Elias Wren was a name spoken in Coldwater Hollow with the same unease one reserved for curses. To some, he was a myth, to others, a ghost who never left the hills. No one could quite agree on when he lived or when he died, but everyone agreed on one thing: Elias had never left his mother's side. The stories painted him as a pale, quiet figure, always seen walking the edge of the forest with his head bowed and his hands clasped behind his back, as if whispering to something only he could see. Children were warned not to follow him if they ever caught a glimpse through the mist, for those who had once did were said never to return. He was a man shaped by isolation, born into silence and raised by a mother who taught him that the world beyond the trees was poisonous. Locals said the Wren house stood miles from the town's edge, half sunk into the earth, its roof long surrendered to moss. At night, when the fog rolled low, strange lights flickered in its windows, soft and rhythmic, like the pulse of something alive. Some believed it was Elias keeping vigil for his dead mother. Others whispered that she was not dead at all, that her presence lingered in that decaying cabin, whispering to her son even after the grave had taken her body. Those who lived closest to the woods claimed they could hear him singing to her, the tune always the same, slow, mournful, and carried on the wind like a prayer no one dared to answer. The truth of Elias Wren's life was tangled in rumor, but the one detail that persisted through every retelling was that he was born of his mother's shame. His father was never named, his birth never recorded. Some said his mother, Sarah Wren, refused to let anyone near the boy, keeping him hidden from the world as if protecting him, or protecting others from him. He grew up without friends, without school, without the intrusion of time. To the people of Coldwater Hollow, Elias and his mother became the embodiment of the town's oldest sin, the act of blood turned inward. Their names became warnings spoken by candlelight, lessons in what happens when a family's roots grow too deep into itself. Even after the cabin was found abandoned and nature began reclaiming what was left, locals swore they still saw Elias in the distance, pale against the dark pines, a figure frozen in time. He was a reminder that some souls never leave the places that made them, that some bloodlines are too bound by their own shadows to ever fade completely from the world. The historian arrived in Coldwater Hollow on a gray afternoon when the clouds hung low enough to brush the tops of the trees. His name was Daniel Harker, a man who had spent years tracing the hidden bloodlines and forgotten tragedies of the Appalachian backwoods. He wasn't driven by fame or fortune but by a quiet obsession with the untold. Old court ledgers, half-burned church records, and the fading scrawl of family Bibles were his treasures. When he came across the name Wren in a county archive, attached to death records that listed no fathers, no birthplaces, and no explanations, it was like finding a thread dangling from a sealed history. The documents mentioned a settlement called Coldwater Hollow, a place that hadn't appeared on modern maps for decades. It was supposed to be gone, yet there it was in black ink, mocking him with its persistence. As he drove deeper into the mountains, the road thinned until it became little more than a scar through the forest. Every sign of civilization seemed to vanish behind him, and the silence pressed in heavier with each passing mile. He knew from experience that these forgotten places rarely welcomed outsiders. Towns like Coldwater Hollow guarded their pasts with the same ferocity that mountain lions guarded their dens. But Daniel couldn't turn away, not when the records hinted at something more than simple poverty or isolation. There were references to unlawful kinship, to unnamed heirs, and one phrase that unsettled him most: the blood remains unbroken. By the time he reached the first rusted mailbox bearing the name Wren, he could feel the eyes on him. The town seemed frozen in another century, porches bowed beneath their own weight, roofs patched with tin, fields overgrown with weeds that had long since conquered their fences. A few residents watched him pass, their expressions unreadable. There was no welcome, only wary recognition, as if they already knew why he had come. He stopped at the only building that looked alive, a diner whose flickering sign read, Mabel's Eatery. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of coffee that had boiled too long. When Daniel mentioned the name Elias Wren, the chatter stopped. An old man in the corner finally spoke, his voice brittle with age. "You're not the first to come asking," he said. "But you'll be the last to stay if you find what you're looking for." The warning lingered like smoke as Daniel left, notebook in hand, unaware that he had already stepped across a threshold, one that separated the curious from the cursed. The abandoned cabin stood at the edge of the forest, where the trees grew so dense that daylight seemed afraid to enter. Daniel found it after 2 days of searching, following faint directions from a reluctant local who pointed toward the old Wren place, with trembling hands. The path leading there was nearly invisible, swallowed by vines and years of neglect. Every step deeper into the woods brought a sense of trespass, as if the forest itself disapproved of his presence. When he finally reached the clearing, he saw what time and rot had done to the house. The roof sagged under the weight of moss, the windows were hollow sockets, and the door hung crooked on one hinge. It looked less like a home and more like a carcass of something that had once lived. Inside, the air was stale and heavy, carrying the smell of wet wood and forgotten years. Dust floated through beams of thin light that pierced through the cracks in the walls. The floorboards groaned beneath Daniel's boots as he stepped cautiously, scanning the room. The remnants of a life still lingered: broken dishes, a child's rusted toy, a single chair turned toward the empty fireplace. But what caught his attention most was a small wooden chest, half buried under debris. Its lid was warped but still locked. He pried it open carefully, revealing a stack of journals bound in cracked leather, their pages yellowed and brittle. On the first one, a name was etched faintly across the cover in uneven handwriting: Sarah Wren. Daniel began to read by the weak light from his lantern, the ink faded but legible. The entries began innocently enough, mentions of farming, weather, and loneliness. But as the years passed, the tone shifted. The later pages spoke of purity, of God's design through the blood, and of a son who was chosen to preserve what was untainted. The words grew erratic, desperate, as if written by someone at war with their own mind. She described her son Elias not as a child but as a vessel of divine purpose. The entries blurred the line between devotion and madness, and by the final journal, Sarah's handwriting was barely coherent. One passage repeated the same sentence again and again: the blood must stay whole. Daniel's hands trembled as he turned the last page. A small photograph fell from between the pages, a young man and an older woman standing side by side, their faces eerily similar, almost identical. Behind them, the cabin looked almost new, untouched by decay. Outside, the wind began to rise, whistling through the trees like a voice that had waited too long to be heard. As Daniel read deeper into the final pages of Sarah Wren's journals, a grim pattern began to take shape, one that blurred the boundary between faith and depravity. Her writings grew feverish, filled with references to visions and divine commands. She wrote that the world beyond the hollow had been poisoned by sin, that outsiders carried corruption in their blood, and that her family alone had been chosen to remain pure. The words spoke of a pact, a sacred covenant she claimed had been made generations before her, to keep the Wren bloodline unbroken, untouched by the outside world. Each child was to be born not of strangers, but of their own kind. In her mind, it was not an abomination but a preservation of divine order. She believed their isolation was not punishment, but protection. The entries about Elias began when he was just a boy. Sarah wrote of his unusual quietness, his refusal to speak for days, and his uncanny resemblance to her late husband, who had died, or perhaps disappeared, years before the child's birth. As the years passed, her tone shifted from maternal affection to reverence. She began describing Elias as a sign, a continuation of the promise. By the time he reached manhood, she no longer referred to him as her son, but as her equal, her mirror, the one who would complete the circle. The final pages made Daniel's blood run cold. They described a ritual under a moonless sky, a binding of flesh and faith, and the conception of a child that Sarah called both her daughter and her granddaughter. It became clear that the horror whispered through Coldwater Hollow was not folklore, it was legacy. Elias had fathered a child with his own mother, an act justified through years of isolation and delusion. Sarah's words made it sound like devotion, as though she had convinced herself that what she did was sacred. But between her ramblings, Daniel found traces of guilt, fragments of clarity where she admitted to hearing voices that were not divine at all. She wrote of dreams where the walls bled and her child's eyes reflected her own face over and over again. Her final entry ended abruptly, the ink smudged by what looked like tears. Daniel sat in the ruins of the cabin, the pages spread before him, and felt the weight of generations pressing down. This was not merely the story of a mother and son, it was the story of a town that had turned away, choosing silence over salvation. Outside, the forest seemed to hold its breath, as if aware that its oldest secret had just been unearthed. The morning after discovering the journals, Daniel followed a series of strange markings he had noticed the night before while leaving the cabin. They were carved into the trees, deep grooves that spiraled and crossed in unsettling patterns. At first, he thought they might be old logging signs, but the more he followed them, the less sense they made. Each mark seemed deliberate, etched with a kind of precision that suggested ritual rather than work. The further he went, the denser the carvings became, as though he were walking through a forest that had been scarred by the same desperate hand for decades. Some of the symbols matched the ones Sarah Wren had drawn in her journals, circles within circles, shapes that seemed to fold in on themselves. They looked less like language and more like obsession. The path wound deeper into the woods until the trees suddenly gave way to an open field blanketed with mist. There, half hidden by tall grass and creeping vines, Daniel saw what appeared to be a cluster of weathered stones. As he drew closer, he realized they were not random markers but gravestones, unmarked, uneven, and crudely carved from local rock. Many had no dates, only a single name chiseled into the surface. Wren. The sight of so many graves bearing the same name sent a chill through him. Some stones were so close together they might as well have marked the same burial, as if entire generations had been laid one atop another. The ground felt soft beneath his boots, damp from years of decay, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the soil itself was restless. Kneeling beside one of the stones, Daniel noticed a small wooden cross driven into the ground beside it. It bore fresh carvings, one of the same spiral symbols he had seen in the trees. That meant someone had been here recently. The thought unsettled him more than the graves themselves. Coldwater Hollow was nearly deserted, yet someone was still tending to this place, still keeping the Wren legacy alive in silence. As the mist thickened, Daniel's lantern caught something glinting near one of the graves, a rusted locket half buried in the dirt. Inside was a faded photograph of a young woman holding a child. Their faces were hauntingly familiar, too similar to be coincidence. He felt a sudden heaviness in the air, an oppressive stillness that made him glance over his shoulder. For a moment, he thought he saw movement among the trees, a pale shape watching from the shadows. But when he blinked, it was gone, leaving only the whisper of leaves and the certainty that the dead in Coldwater Hollow were not as forgotten as they seemed. When Daniel returned to the town after finding the graveyard, he carried the weight of unease with him. The people of Coldwater Hollow seemed to sense it before he even spoke. Conversation stopped as he entered the diner, chairs creaked, and eyes turned away as if the mere presence of what he had seen in the woods clung to him. The old man from before, the one who had warned him not to stir up old bones, sat at his usual table, his expression grim. When Daniel mentioned the carvings and the graves, the man's hand trembled slightly before he set down his coffee. "You shouldn't have gone there," he muttered. "That land don't belong to the living anymore." Others around him nodded in silent agreement. The air in the room thickened, as if the town itself disapproved of what had been spoken aloud. No one wanted to say the Wren name, but it hung between every sentence. Finally, one of the town elders, a woman with a face like old parchment and eyes that hadn't known sleep in years, spoke up. She told Daniel that the Wrens had once been like royalty in Coldwater Hollow, wealthy landowners who kept to themselves and demanded the same from others. They rarely came to town, and when they did, they never mingled. Over time, strange rumors began to spread, that children were being born with deformities, that the family refused doctors, that the same faces appeared generation after generation. People began to speak of them as cursed, not by the devil, but by their own pride. The woman's voice wavered as she described how the curse spread like rot through the bloodline. It wasn't sickness, she said. It was what they did to themselves. What they called holy. She told him that the Wrens had believed they were chosen to keep their blood pure, a belief that twisted into madness as the years went on. When children started dying young and others were born wrong, the townsfolk tried to intervene. But by then, it was too late. The Wren homestead burned under mysterious circumstances, and the few survivors fled into the forest. The town sealed itself off afterward, pretending the Wrens had never existed. Daniel listened, his pen still, realizing the town's silence had not been born of ignorance but of fear. The people of Coldwater Hollow had built their lives around forgetting. They knew that the past had a way of digging itself back up, and the Wrens were proof of that. As Daniel left, the old man called after him, voice low and shaking, "Son, if you keep looking for ghosts in these woods, you might end up joining them." That night, as rain drummed against the windows of his rented room, Daniel couldn't stop thinking about the graves. The images of the repeated names, the symbols, and the woman in the photograph looped in his mind like a haunting refrain. He began to wonder if the Wren bloodline had truly ended, or if remnants of it still walked quietly among the living. The next morning, while the fog still hugged the valley, he was approached by a woman at the edge of town. She introduced herself only as Lila. Her voice was low, her tone cautious, but there was a certain calm in her eyes that unsettled him. She said she knew why he had come and that she could show him what he was really looking for. Daniel followed her through winding backroads and overgrown paths until they reached a small, weather-beaten house half buried under the weight of the forest. Inside, it smelled of herbs and damp earth. On the mantel above the hearth were several framed photographs, most of them old and yellowed. In nearly every one, the same features repeated: pale eyes, high cheekbones, and an eerie sameness that made Daniel's skin crawl. Lila watched him closely as he studied them. When he finally asked how she was connected to the Wrens, she didn't hesitate. "They were my blood," she said. "They still are." Her words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. She explained that her family had spent generations hiding from what they were. The town may have tried to erase the Wrens, but the blood never vanished. It only changed names, moved houses, and buried the truth under silence. Lila confessed that her grandmother had been Elias Wren's daughter, the child born from the bond between him and his mother. She said the stories of deformities weren't exaggerations. "Our faces," she whispered, "are the memories of their sins." Her voice cracked when she revealed that she had recently given birth, and her baby, though beautiful, was showing the same unmistakable traits that marked the Wren bloodline. "It's starting again," she said, her eyes glistening with fear. Daniel sat frozen, unsure whether to comfort her or flee. Every instinct told him he had uncovered something that should have stayed buried. Lila told him that she had been dreaming of the old cabin, of her ancestors calling her back to the woods. "They want her," she said softly, glancing toward the crib in the corner. "The child. To finish what they began." As thunder rolled through the hollow, Daniel understood that the story of the Wrens was not history, it was inheritance, still breathing, still waiting to claim its next victim. The storm came down hard that night, tearing through Coldwater Hollow with a fury that felt almost intentional. Trees bent beneath the wind, rain hammered against rooftops, and lightning lit up the mountains like flashes from another world. Daniel barely slept, his mind haunted by Lila's confession and the thought of that cursed bloodline still pulsing beneath the town's quiet surface. When dawn broke, the rain had slowed, but the valley was cloaked in fog so thick it seemed alive. He decided to return to the old Wren property one last time, hoping to find some kind of proof that would make sense of what he had uncovered. The path was nearly washed away, the forest floor soft and treacherous, but he followed it until he reached the clearing where the cabin once stood. What he found stopped him cold. The storm had ripped through the forest, uprooting trees and tearing away the last layers of soil that had hidden the Wren family's secrets. The cabin had collapsed further during the night, exposing what lay beneath its foundation. At first, he thought the pale shapes jutting from the mud were tree roots, but as he stepped closer, he realized they were bones, human bones, half buried, tangled together in grotesque intimacy. Two skeletons lay intertwined, their arms still locked around one another as if clinging together even in death. From their size and placement, Daniel knew without question who they were. Elias and Sarah Wren. The sight was almost too much to bear. Time had fused them together, bone against bone, mother against son, their remains sealed by the very earth that had hidden their sin. Around them, fragments of wood, rusted nails, and bits of fabric hinted at the structure that once stood above, a shrine of their own making, now reduced to a tomb. Daniel knelt beside them, his breath clouding in the cold air, and noticed something carved into the slab of stone near their remains. The same spiral symbol from the trees and the graves, this time surrounded by words scratched in trembling letters: "The blood must sleep beneath itself." Thunder rolled again in the distance, and Daniel felt the ground tremble beneath him. The soil was eroding fast, revealing more, smaller bones scattered nearby, perhaps the remains of the child born from that union. The wind howled through the clearing, carrying with it the faint sound of a woman's hum, the same eerie tune he'd heard the first night he found the cabin. It grew louder, circling him, until he realized it wasn't the wind at all but something deeper, something that had never left these woods. In that moment, he understood that the Wrens had not only buried their sins here, they had bound them to the land itself. Daniel left the clearing shaken to his core, the image of the entwined skeletons burned into his mind like a brand. The wind carried the scent of damp earth and decay, and though the storm had passed, the forest seemed to hum with a low, unearthly vibration. He made his way back toward the town, but every path looked different now, as if the woods themselves were shifting around him. The rainwater had turned the trails into rivers of mud, and the mist moved like something alive, curling around the trees and whispering through the branches. For the first time since he arrived, Daniel felt a presence following him, not seen but sensed, a heaviness in the air, a pressure that grew stronger the closer he got to the edge of the hollow. When he finally reached the main road, Coldwater looked even more deserted than before. The windows were dark, doors bolted shut, and not a single sound came from the houses. It was as if the entire town had gone into hiding. He stopped at the diner where he had first heard the warning, but it was empty now, chairs overturned, dust scattered across the floor. A pot of coffee still steamed faintly on the counter, as though the people had vanished only moments ago. On the wall behind the register, he saw something new, one of the spiral carvings, freshly etched into the wood. Beneath it, written in dark ink that looked disturbingly fresh, were the words, "It wakes when remembered." Daniel's pulse quickened. He pulled out his notebook, scanning through his notes, his transcriptions of the journals, the photographs, every piece of evidence that had led him here. He realized with growing dread that by uncovering the Wren's story, by speaking their names and tracing their symbols, he might have done exactly what the town had spent generations trying to prevent. The silence, the secrecy, the deliberate forgetting, it hadn't been fear alone that kept the truth buried. It had been containment. Outside, a faint sound echoed through the fog, like laughter mixed with weeping. Daniel turned toward the sound, his flashlight cutting through the mist, but there was nothing there, only the distant outline of the woods waiting for him to return. For a moment, he saw movement near the tree lean, a small figure standing perfectly still, watching him. The shape was pale and childlike, its face obscured by shadows, but its stance felt achingly familiar. He blinked, and it was gone, leaving only the whisper of the wind and the faint hum of that same mournful tune. As he stood there, notebook trembling in his hand, Daniel realized the story wasn't over. The Wren bloodline had never ended, it had only been waiting for someone to call it back.